Okay, step number 10. Here we're going to be starting to sand. This is not final sanding, it's just some preparation sanding, getting some gaps filled in, some cracks, any defects, glue, anything like that off. Later we're going to do some absolute final sanding up to the higher grit. So all we're doing first is just some rough sanding with some 80 or 100 grit sandpaper. It says you need to sand the entire storage chest, both the outside and the inside. So don't forget to sand on the inside as well if you have pencil marks or other things on that. Use a finish sander or random orbit sander. You know, you're welcome to use either. They both work just fine. We got a random orbit sander here. 80 or 100 grit is a good one to start with. If you start with that higher grit, 220, 320, something like that, it's not going to do much. So get one of the more rough pieces here. I think I've got some 100 grit on this one here. Start with the more rough. You want to get off scratch marks, glue marks, pencil marks, anything that you don't want on here. One suggestion on your corners. If you see on our corners here, sometimes there's little gaps. So when you're sanding the corners, you may want to actually round over the corner just a little bit. Not majorly, but just a little bit. So you can take your sander here, and I can see I've got a little crack going on right there where those two lock miters came together. And just take your sander and you're going to round them over. And you can kind of see how it actually blends that in. You can't really see that it's two separate boards now to where it's going to be able to fill those cracks in. Some of you might have some really big gaps on your corners. If that's the case, you might either have to round a little bit more, or we might have to use some wood filler, and I'm going to show you that today too. There's another technique you can use as well. You want to soften any sharp edges by hand. Anywhere where people might grab this thing, the corners, underneath our little molding pieces here, anywhere where there's a sharp edge on the inside here, take some sandpaper, something that's used, just in your hand, and just at an angle, just soften that enough that it's not going to be sharp. It doesn't take that long on this. Don't use the random orbit or finish sanders for that. That's going to be too aggressive and take off too much. So just by hand, softening some of those sharp corners. We're not rounding. We're just knocking off that sharp edge. So don't round it. Otherwise the top doesn't fit on very well. Okay, it says also fill in any cracks, gaps, or nail holes with wood filler. Or use the sawdust and glue technique. And I want to show you both those. In my tool cabinet I've got some wood filler. Now this stuff, it works okay. It's not perfect. If at all possible, try to get everything so you don't have to use this. But this can help us out if you have some big gaps or cracks or nail holes or things like that that you want to fill. On the top of it has a type of wood chosen, so don't just grab a random one. If you're doing walnut, don't grab maple. You know, get the kind of wood filler that you're using. So on mine, I've got some nail holes here where I use the pin nailer, and I want to fill those little nail holes in. And my board is cherry, so I found some cherry wood filler. This stuff here, it dries out super fast. So keep the lid on it all the time. If you need some, you can get that lid off. If it's inside, if it's all dried up, let me know. We can stir it up and add some thinner to it. Don't add water. If you add water, you just ruined it. So if it's dried up, let me know. But this one should be fine. You're just going to get a little bit. A little bit. Don't get a big old chunk of this stuff, okay? You're wasting it and all that. Just a small little corner amount is plenty. And then keep the lid on it when you're not using it. So that thing dries out within minutes, so keep that lid on it. All I'm going to do is just press it in. You can use your putty knife here and press it in anywhere those nail holes are, and it'll help fill those in. If you have some extra, I would recommend scrape off some of the extra there so you don't have to sand as much. But you can use this wood filler here just to scrape off, fill in some of those holes. And then let that dry. It'll change color to about the color of your wood when it's dry. Right now you can see it's a different color. And it'll harden up. And so that you can use to fill in. Again, please don't waste my wood filler. Another technique I show is sawdust and glue. You can actually create your own wood filler with a little bit of sawdust and glue. So if I wanted to fill in this hole here with some glue and sawdust, what I would do is I would take a glue bottle. The key is don't do a ton of glue, a tiny bit of glue. Okay, a little dot or so. I may have even did too much there. I'm going to scrape some of that off. And then you want to build up some sawdust. So take some used sandpaper. Don't get a brand new piece. Some used stuff, kind of rough, maybe 100 grit, 120 is fine. Don't do the really fine stuff. We need to build up some sawdust. So I'm going to start sanding away, not where it's at, but build up some sawdust. And then when you mix it with that glue, as I get closer here, that sawdust will mix with the glue. And then it'll fill in your little holes there. Okay, so it kind of acts as its own little wood filler. So that's another little technique you can do. That works really, really well on some of these corner gaps as well. So if you put a little bit of glue down and then sand over that, that can fill in those little gaps too. These small little things that you're doing here to fill in these gaps and cracks make a huge difference. You know, if you look at someone's storage chest that didn't do this and someone that did, it's a major difference. So take the time to fill in any gaps and cracks. You can't do the glue on huge holes. If you have a big crack, don't use the sawdust and glue. Use the wood filler on the big stuff. So if you have just a small little crack somewhere or a small little hole, that sawdust and glue works really well. All right, you'll do that on the whole outside of your storage chest, anywhere where there's holes, gaps, cracks, things like that. Sand it up really, really well. After that, you're going to start to make your top. And on here it just says, get a board from the wood storage room, get the type of wood you're using for your storage chest. Typically people do the top, the panel, is what we're making, the same type of wood you did on these panels for your storage chest. Now, I did maple on my inside panel, so I chose to do maple on my top. And I've already glued up this part of it to save some time. You guys know how to do that. You know how to cut on the radial arm saw, the table saw and all that, and glue boards together. So all I did was it says, get your board glued together. This is number 13 on your paper. That's more than 8 inches wide and 20 inches long. So I made sure when I glued this, I'm about 8 3/4 and I'm about 20 1/4. So as long as you're more than 8, more than 20, you're fine. Now if you flip your paper over to the back side, I want to just remind you on this part, because I want to show you this part. Number 14, it says square up your panel and cut it to the exact dimensions needed. It's too big right now, we're going to cut it down. To square up a panel just means to trim it on all 4 sides and then the face, flatten it out too. So I haven't done anything to this yet except just glue boards together. So it says it should be 3/4 inch thick, 8 inches wide, and 18 inches long. That's my final dimensions. To remind you how to do that, I've listed step by step. It says steps to square a panel. First, joint one edge. So let's go to the jointer. Let's do this. Follow along with me, and just to remind you how to do it. So joint one edge. It doesn't matter which edge you joint. Just choose an edge and go ahead and joint it. And I'm going to mark that edge. Make sure I know that's my jointed edge. Okay, next. Cut to width on table saw. My width is 8 inches wide, so I can go to the table saw and cut it 8 inches wide. Jointed edge against that fence. Okay. Next, after the table saw, it says trim one end on the panel saw. So your ends, when you glued them together, they didn't come together perfect, so we're going to just trim one of these over on the panel saw. It doesn't matter which one, just trimming one end flat on the panel saw. Come on over to the panel saw. Okay, we're going to trim one end on the panel saw, just put it past where it's going to cut just a little bit. Just trimming one end flat. Next, it says cut to length on the miter saw or the table saw. The length of this needs to be 18 inches, so I need to cut this exactly 18 now. And we're going to go over to the miter saw or the table saw to do this cross cut. Let's head over to the miter saw. I'm going to show you on that one. My miter saw, it actually can cut up to 8 inches pretty close. You can use the table saw as well, but this miter saw actually has a blade enough that it'll just barely cut through this all the way here. So you got it exactly 18 inches long. If you would prefer, you can actually use the miter saw for your first cut to trim that in flat instead of going over to the panel saw. You can do both cuts on the miter saw, that's fine. So I just show you the panel saw just because typically we usually use the panel saw for these cross cuts on the bigger boards, but this can actually handle it, so you can do that. Okay, after that, surface it down to 13/16 thick on the planer. So head over to the planer. Okay, we're going down to 13/16 right now. I'm 15/16, so I'm going to set this first to 14/16. Run it through, then we'll set it to 13/16 and run it through. Okay, then we'll go. Make sure you flip the board over and get the other face. Okay. Last, it says sand down to 3/4 on the time saver sander. So again, we've just got it at close. Now we're going to go final sand it on the time saver sander. Last step, come on over. Okay, just a reminder on our time saver sander, you're starting at whatever it was thickness-wise, and we're going to go down to 3/4. So I had planed it down to 13/16, so that's where I'm going to start. 13/16, 0.812. So let's get this at 0.812. We'll send it through with the grain. Go down that 100th of an inch, so that's 0.802. Put the board over, get the other face. Keep going all the way down to 0.750. You guys know how to do this. Once you're done, come give my signature. Okay? Thank you guys.